Hello, my name is Dr. Langton Makuwerere Dube, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Before I introduce my research focus and my research interests, it is very imperative that I give a brief background of Africa as a continent in relation to China. Africa is at that cusp of history where the continent lags behind in almost every facet of development, be it socially, politically, or economically. So we are looking, for example, at infrastructure, which remains, backward and obsolete across the breadth of the continent, save for certain spaces, but generally across the continent, infrastructure remains backward and obsolete. We're also looking at development finance, which remains very ad hoc and in some spaces also very elusive. We are also looking, for example, in terms of value chains. Africa's value chains remain very much undeveloped, and such that those path dependencies between the undeveloped, the global south, and the industrialized north, they remain intact and unchanged. We're also looking, for example, at governance. Another Achilles heel for the continent remains governance, and across the breadth of the continent, we see much of acute weak statehood. Well, the funny part is that most of these states are very strong at the center in terms of the security of state institutions, but very poor in the periphery in terms of delivering, political goods. We are also looking at another striking feature across the African continent in terms of the demographic dividend, that Africa is experiencing a bulging youth population, which, when combined with all the other, aforementioned problems, deficiencies, if I may say, that I've mentioned, it can become actually a threat to peace and development across the continent, because the youth, they want jobs, the youth, they want opportunities, the youth, they want food, and everything. And if governments cannot provide the requisite infrastructure, if government cannot provide the requisite development finance, if government cannot provide the requisite value chains, and if governments cannot provide the requisite state institution or the requisite institutions to spearhead development, we are looking at a bleak future for the continent. And overarchingly, we are looking at the African continent suffering, for example, from acute food insecurity, for example, suffering from, for example, insecurity across much of the continent, and also suffering heavily from the effects, for example, of climate change. Having said that, I would want to mention that China remains a very important partner to the continent in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of development finance, in terms of value chains, in terms of reinvigorating the vitality of governance, especially, or government institutions, in terms of engendering socio-political and economic development. Therefore, my research focus, to begin with, my research focus looks into the political ecology of land, starting from the baseline that land is the abode of all natural resources. So be it agriculture, for example, be it mining, everything happens on the land. So generally, I'm looking at the impact of Chinese mining investments, for example, in Zimbabwe, how the impact that Chinese mining investments will have in terms of economic development, the impact that they will have in terms of the environment, for example, in terms of corporate social responsibility in the host communities that mining is taking place, but overarchingly as well, the impact that Chinese mining investment, or Chinese investments in general, have on the vitality of governance, in Zimbabwe, the future of governance, or the of governance institutions, in Zimbabwe. And also, I'm looking, for example, at infrastructure development. My research interest also focuses on projects, for example, Chinese flagship projects, for example, like the Belt and Road Initiative, and how it is going to improve infrastructure across much of the country. As I have alluded to earlier, the infrastructure deficit across the African continent remains very, 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 very precarious. What are we talking about here? For any economic development to kickstart, you need, for example, a sustainable supply of energy. So energy provision, infrastructure for energy provision remains very, very, very much backward across much of the continent. Here I'm talking, for example, we have seen Chinese investments coming under the BRI to develop, for example, the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia to provide energy not only to Ethiopia, but I think possibly to Sudan and to Egypt as well. We have seen, how Chinese investment under the BRI, has improved, for example, in terms of economic development. For example, the Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, most recently in Tanzania. We have seen also Chinese investments, for example, in Zimbabwe, revamping, for example, the Kariba hydropower station, the Hwange thermal power station, and various many other projects that the Chinese are investing in across much of the continent. Because for any economic development to kickstart, there is need for a robust and resilient infrastructure. And China remains a very, very important partner to the African continent in terms of the provision of infrastructure that is very, very important for economic development to start. Again, China remains a very important partner to the continent in terms of development finance. As opposed to Western finance that comes with strings attached, Chinese have come with their own values, saying that they are not interested in interfering in internal affairs of other countries. Their loans, they come with no strings attached, as opposed to Western investment finance. And my research focus also interrogates the vitality as well and the future. The ambiguity surrounding Chinese development finance across much of the continent. And also in terms of value chains, for example. We need more value chains, for example, in terms of industry. How do we add value? Africa remains entrapped in that stage where the production of primary goods is the continent's main preoccupation. So in terms of that, the continent really needs to learn a lot, really needs to import more technologies from China. And China has become a very, very important partner in terms of value addition. Value addition that creates more jobs, value addition that creates more economic security for individuals and even for the country, for the countries themselves. But another important aspect as well, where my research interests also delve into, is into the issue of governance. Reading through the book by the Chinese president, The Governance of China, written by Mr. Xi Jinping, I came to the conclusion, and somewhere along the text, there is somewhere that Mr. Xi Jinping mentions that for development in China to kickstart, it was a realization by the party that they need to revitalize governance. They need to revitalize government institutions to promote the resilience of government institutions. And this is where most of African countries lag behind. In terms of the security of the state institutions, African states are very strong, but in terms of delivering political goods, those bureaucratic institutions responsible for delivering political goods, African states remain lagging behind. And the biggest question has been, does Africa need to replicate or to imitate the Chinese development model? Which is where I think in terms of party-to-party relations, my research focus intends to interrogate how African governments or how China-Africa relations can promote or can revitalize the resilience or reinvigorate the strength of African state institutions to deliver political goods. So overarchingly, I'm looking at China as a very important partner to the African continent. I mean, the relationship between China and the African continent dates back to ages. We are looking at, for example, in the case of Zimbabwe, during the Liberation War, how China provided logistical, financial support towards the prosecution of the War of Liberation, and how even after the war, China has remained, even in the post-independence era, China has remained a steadfast partner in terms of development aid, in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of value chains, in terms of even providing, education, for example, education scholarships, people-to-people exchanges, cultural exchanges. China has remained a very valuable partner. So overarchingly, my research focuses on understanding the background, maybe the present, and maybe the future, and the contradictions that emanate within Sino-Africa relations. Thank you very much.